The third line, the negative sign is misdistributed. The second term must be positive.
She's right.
Yeah, the second term is positive.
All right, let's not get ahead of ourselves.
It's a fact.
Excuse me, Professor. I believe there's an error in the third line of your proof. The lecture hall went silent. Hundreds of people turned to stare at the young black woman standing in the back row. Professor Conrad Whitlock did not even look up from the board. Security really lets anyone in these days. Then he turned slowly. Let me guess. Community college. You look like you came straight off a long bus ride. Sit down before you embarrass yourself any further. A graduate student beside her picked up his bag and moved away. The front row laughed. Someone pulled out a phone and started filming. A woman nearby whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear. Who let her in here? Not one person stood up for her. Not one. But every single person in that room was about to learn a lesson they would never forget. They had no idea how badly they had underestimated her. Watch how this plays out. To understand what happened next, you have to understand where this story takes place. Harvard University, Cambridge, Massachusetts, one of the most powerful academic institutions on the planet. And inside that institution, there was a man who believed he owned the building. Professor Conrad Whitlock, a tenured professor of mathematics, chair of the Department of Applied Mathematics, fellow of the American Mathematical Society, and author of a graduate textbook cited more than 14,000 times. His grandfather had been a Harvard dean. His father had been a Harvard professor. Conrad Whitlock did not simply attend Harvard. He inherited it. Every autumn, the university hosted an event called the Whitlock Distinguished Lecture Series in Applied Mathematics. Hear that name again? The lecture series was named after his family, funded by his family's endowment, organized by him, and judged by him. It was his kingdom. The event brought together the best graduate students, postdoctoral researchers, and visiting scholars from across the country. Near the end, there was a public competition. 4 rounds of increasing difficulty. Participants solved problems on a whiteboard in front of a live audience. A panel of 3 judges scored each round. After each round, the lowest scorers were eliminated. The winner received 2 things: a public commendation from Harvard and a personal letter of recommendation from Professor Whitlock. For most people in that room, that letter was a nice bonus. For the woman standing in the back row, it was everything. Her name was Maren Caldwell, a young woman born and raised in Anacostia, one of the poorest neighborhoods in Washington, District of Columbia. Her mother, Regina Caldwell, cleaned offices at Georgetown University for most of Maren's life. They never had much. Some weeks, they did not have enough. Maren taught herself advanced mathematics, not at a prep school, not with a private tutor. She used discarded textbooks and free Massachusetts Institute of Technology lecture videos on a tablet with a cracked screen. She watched the same lectures again and again until the concepts stopped feeling confusing and started feeling obvious. She earned a full scholarship to Howard University, graduated summa cum laude, double majored in pure mathematics and philosophy, and became the top student in her department. Then she applied to doctoral programs at every Ivy League university in the country. Every single one rejected her. The letters were polite. They all said the same thing. Not the right fit. No explanation. No feedback. Just a closed door with a polite sign on it. So Maren took a job tutoring math at a community center in Washington, District of Columbia. She saved money. She waited. And when she heard about the Whitlock Lecture Series, open enrollment, anyone could audit, she bought a bus ticket to Boston. A long ride on a Greyhound, a backpack with 2 changes of clothes, a budget motel far from campus, and gas station sandwiches for dinner. She did not come to make friends. She came because that letter could open every door that had been slammed in her face. But from the moment she walked in, the room made one thing clear. She was not welcome. It was not just Whitlock. It was everything. The portraits on the walls, all white men. The leather seats filled with students who greeted each other by first name. The way people looked at her backpack and then looked away. A staff member near the entrance asked if she was there for the catering setup. Early in the lecture series, Marin sat in the back row and took notes. She watched how Whitlock treated different people. When white students asked questions, he leaned forward. He engaged. He smiled. When a black visiting student asked a question, he paused. He rephrased it. More precisely, he said, then answered his own version. He did not smile. A graduate student named Blaine Mercer sat near Marin during one session. He turned to his friend and said loudly enough for her to hear, "I did not know they gave auditing passes to community colleges." His friend laughed. Marin did not react. She kept writing. That night, alone in her motel room, she read the competition rules one more time. 4 rounds open to all participants, judged on correctness, elegance, and speed. She closed the laptop and stared at the ceiling. She had not come this far to sit in the back row, but Marin did not know that the hardest part would not be getting into the competition. It would be facing what Professor Whitlock had already planned for anyone who dared to challenge him. During one lecture, Professor Whitlock stood at the front of the hall, chalk in hand, working through an advanced proof involving graph coloring. His writing was fast and confident. Every line flowed into the next like he had done it 1,000 times. The room was quiet. Hundreds of people watched in admiration. But Marin was not watching with admiration. She was watching with focus. Her eyes moved from the first line to the second. Fine. From the second to the third. She stopped. She tilted her head. She looked at her notebook. She looked back at the board. She checked her notes again. In the third line, Whitlock had distributed a negative sign across a binomial expression, but he had missed the second term. The sign should have been positive, not negative. It was a small error, the kind most people would overlook, but Marin was not most people. She could already see the chain reaction. That one wrong sign changed the inequality in the 5th line, which collapsed the bound in the 8th line, which meant the entire conclusion was wrong. She raised her hand. Whitlock did not look at her. He scanned the front rows, pointed at Pierce Langford, his star doctoral student, sitting near the front, and took his question instead. Pierce asked something about real-world applications. Whitlock smiled and answered warmly. They exchanged ideas like old friends. Marin's hand was still in the air. Whitlock finally glanced toward the back of the room. His smile disappeared. Yes, the auditor. Not her name. Not Miss. Not you in the back. The auditor. A category, not a person. Marin began to speak. Professor, in the 3rd line of your proof. He held up one finger and cut her off. I will take questions from enrolled participants first. If there is time at the end, auditors may submit questions in writing. He turned back to the board. Conversation over. The room went quiet. Not the kind of quiet that comes from sympathy, the kind that comes from discomfort. A few students in the front row exchanged glances. Blaine Mercer smirked. Someone in the middle section whispered, she really thought she could just speak up. Zora Dawson, a black woman sitting beside Marin, another auditing visitor, gripped her armrest so hard her knuckles turned pale. She looked at Marin with an expression that said, let it go. It is not worth it. But Marin did not let it go. She looked at the board. She looked at the man who had just reduced her to a label. She looked at a room full of people who had already decided she had nothing worth saying. And she raised her hand again. This time, the room noticed. Not because they supported her, but because they were curious. The way a crowd is curious when someone walks toward the edge of a cliff. Pierce turned around in his seat. 2 postdoctoral researchers stopped whispering. Even Blaine looked back. Whitlock saw the hand. He knew the room was watching. If he ignored her again, it would look petty. If he let her speak, she might embarrass herself, and that would prove his point. He sighed. The sigh of a man doing someone a favor they did not deserve. Fine, go ahead. Marin stood up. She did not rush. She did not stammer. She looked directly at the board and opened her mouth, and what she said next made every single person in that room stop breathing. Marin stood in the back row. She did not step forward. She did not move to the aisle. She stood exactly where she was and spoke in a voice that was calm, clear, and absolutely steady. In the third line, when you distributed the negative across the binomial, the second term should be positive, not negative. She paused, not for drama, but to give the room time to look at the board. That changes the inequality in the fifth line, which means the bound you stated in the eighth line does not hold. Then she sat down. That was it. A few sentences. No apology. No nervous laugh. No, I could be wrong. She said what she saw, and she sat down. The room did not react right away. There was a silence. Not polite, not respectful. It was the silence of hundreds of minds doing math at once. Every head turned toward the board. Eyes moved to the third line. Fingers traced the negative sign. Lips moved silently, recalculating. One by one, the realization spread across the room like a wave. She was right. The sign was wrong. The inequality in the fifth line collapsed. The bound in the eighth line was invalid. The entire conclusion, the conclusion a tenured Harvard professor had presented with absolute confidence, was built on a mistake that a young woman from Anacostia had caught almost immediately. Professor Whitlock knew before most of the room did. You could see it in the way his hand stopped moving. You could see it in the way his jaw tightened just slightly before he turned around. But Conrad Whitlock had not survived a lifetime in academia without learning how to protect himself. He faced the room. He smiled. It was the kind of smile that costs a lot of effort. "An interesting observation," he said. "The sign is indeed reversed. However, this does not materially affect the conclusion of the proof." That was a lie, and every person in that room with a graduate-level education knew it was a lie. The sign error did not simply affect the conclusion. It destroyed it. Whitlock was betting that the authority of his name would outweigh the authority of her math. For his entire career, that bet had always worked. But something was different this time. A postdoctoral researcher in the front row, a woman named Dr. Serena Bellamy, opened her notebook and started checking the proof from the beginning. Then a student behind her did the same thing. Then Pierce Langford, Whitlock's own protege, pulled out a pen and began working through the derivation. The silent rechecking was the judgment. No one said a word. No one needed to. The sound of pens scratching on paper said everything. Whitlock watched it happen. He stood at the front of the room and watched his own students verify that he was wrong, and that the woman he had just humiliated was right. He did not lose the room in that moment, but for the first time in his career, he felt it shift. And at the panel table, something else was happening. Dr. Lenora Calloway, visiting professor from Princeton, one of the foremost number theorists in the country, and one of the only black women to hold a named chair at an elite research university, tilted her head slightly. She looked at the board. She looked at Marin. She opened her notebook and wrote 2 words. "Checker." She did not say anything out loud. She did not need to. She had seen enough. During the break, Zora grabbed Marin's arm in the hallway. "Do you have any idea what you just did?" Marin looked at her. "I pointed out a sign error." Zora stared at her. "You pointed out a sign error to a man who named a lecture series after himself, in his own building, in front of his own students, in front of a packed hall." Marin's expression did not change, but something shifted in her eyes. Not triumph. Something quieter than that. A realization. Maybe the door was not as locked as she had always believed. The break ended. Students filed back into the hall. The energy in the room had changed. It was subtle, but it was real. People who had ignored Marin before were now glancing at her. Not with warmth, not yet, with curiosity. The kind of curiosity that comes when you realize you might have underestimated someone. And then Whitlock made his move. He walked to the front of the room and made an announcement. He said that in the spirit of open scholarship, the upcoming public competition would be expanded. All participants, including auditing guests, were welcome to register. He looked directly at Marin when he said it. He smiled. It was a warm smile, a generous smile, the kind of smile a man gives when he is setting a trap. "After all," he said. "If our auditing guest has such a sharp eye for errors, I am sure she will find the competition quite stimulating." A few students laughed. Blaine Mercer grinned. But Marin did not laugh. She did not grin. She looked back at Whitlock with an expression that gave away nothing. She nodded once. She was in, and she had no idea, not yet, that the game had already been rigged before it even started. When the competition began, the lecture hall had been transformed. The chairs were arranged for the challenge. The panel of 3 judges sat at a long table at the front. A large whiteboard stood in the center of the stage. The first rows were reserved for the official participants. The remaining seats were packed with spectators. Every seat was taken. People stood along the back wall. Marin sat in the front row for the first time. She was the only participant without a formal invitation, the only auditor, the only Howard graduate, the only person carrying a backpack instead of a leather portfolio. 12 competitors. 11 of them had been handpicked by Whitlock. The 12th had been dared to show up. The rules were simple. Each round, a problem appeared on the board. Participants had a set amount of time to solve it, then present their solution. The panel scored on 3 criteria: correctness, elegance, and speed. The lowest scores were eliminated each round. The final round would be one-on-one. In the first round, the problem was an optimization problem, a variant of what mathematicians call the assignment problem, a scheduling puzzle involving how to match tasks to resources in the most efficient way. The other participants began setting up the standard approach. It was called the Hungarian method, a well-known algorithm taught in every graduate program. Pierce Langford moved quickly and confidently. He knew the technique cold. Marin looked at the problem for a moment. She did not start writing. She just stared. Then she saw something no one else saw. The problem had a hidden symmetry. The structure of the graph was bipartite, meaning it could be split into 2 groups with connections only between them, not within them. And that symmetry meant the entire problem could be reframed. Instead of using the standard method, Marin converted it into a minimum cost flow problem on a much smaller network. She walked to the board and started writing. Her solution was half the length of everyone else's. She finished first, not by a small margin, by a wide one. Pierce finished second. His answer was correct, but his approach was the long way around. He had built a highway. Marin had found a shortcut no one else even knew existed. The panel scored. Marin received the highest marks. Pierce came in second. Whitlock, sitting in the audience, did not clap. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and the room began to shift. Students who had smirked at Marin earlier were now leaning forward. A few pulled out their phones, not to mock her this time, but to record her. Someone in the back row typed out a post. "An auditor from Howard is leading the Whitlock Challenge at Harvard. You need to see this." It spread fast through academic circles. Wait, she really walked into Harvard with a backpack and an education built on a cracked tablet, and now she is beating everybody. Nobody can say anything, because the math speaks for itself, and they are still looking at her like she is nothing. That is wild. Between rounds, something happened behind the scenes. Whitlock approached the panel during the break. He suggested that the remaining problems should increase in theoretical depth. That sounded reasonable. It was not. It was code. It meant shifting the problems toward areas that required access to cutting-edge research, the kind shared in exclusive Harvard seminars, the kind a student from Howard would never have seen. Dr. Calloway noticed. She did not object. Not yet. But she watched, and she began keeping a careful record. Meanwhile, Marin was in the hallway eating a granola bar from her backpack. She had no idea what was being discussed. She had no idea the rules were being quietly reshaped against her. She was just reviewing her notes and trying to ignore the fact that her hands were shaking. Not from fear, but from the sheer effort of being the only person in the room no one expected to be there. Zora found her in the hallway, sat down beside her, and stayed quiet for a while. Then she said, "You know they are going to come for you, right?" Marin looked at her. "I know, and you are still going to do this. I did not ride a bus all the way here just to quit after the first round. Zora almost smiled, but the next round would not be a standard problem from a textbook, and the scoring would not be what it seemed. Because while Marin was eating a granola bar in a hallway, Professor Whitlock was in a room making sure the game she was winning would become a game she could not win. In the second round, the problem appeared on the board. It asked participants to prove a mathematical claim about a specific property of connected graphs. It looked straightforward. Every participant in the room picked up their chalk and began constructing a proof. Pierce was writing fast. Two other doctoral candidates were working through careful, methodical steps. The room was quiet except for the sound of chalk on boards. Marin did not pick up her chalk. She stood in front of the board and stared at the statement. The audience began to whisper. Blaine Mercer leaned toward the person beside him and said, "Looks like she finally hit her ceiling." But Marin was not stuck. She was thinking. And what she was thinking was something no one else in the room had considered. The statement was false. Everyone else was trying to prove something that could not be proved. They were building roads to a city that did not exist. Marin saw it. She saw that if you constructed a small graph, just 6 vertices carefully connected, the entire claim fell apart. She picked up the chalk. She drew the graph, 6 dots, a specific pattern of lines between them. She stepped back and said, "This is a counterexample. The statement is false." The panel conferred. Dr. Calloway examined the graph closely. She checked each connection. She nodded. The statement was indeed false. Several participants were eliminated on the spot. They had used their entire time trying to prove something that had never been true. Marin moved forward. The scores were announced. Marin received a 91. She frowned slightly but said nothing. She had no way of knowing that the score on the panel's original sheet was 98. Someone had changed it between the scoring table and the announcement. 7 points stolen. Remember that. In the third round, the problem involved finding the maximum independent set in a specific class of graphs. In simple terms, given a network of connected points, find the largest group of points where none are directly connected to each other. For this kind of problem, the allowed time was almost nothing. The other participants dove in immediately, working through the problem step by step. Pierce was fast. His pen moved with precision. He was building the answer from the ground up, testing combinations, eliminating options. Marin did something different. She looked at the graph and drew its complement, a mirror image where every connection became a gap and every gap became a connection. This transformed the independent set problem into a click problem. Finding the largest group of unconnected points in the original graph became finding the largest group of fully connected points in the new graph. And the new graph was much simpler. She identified the click visually. She wrote down the answer. She put the chalk down with time still remaining. Pierce finished shortly before the buzzer. His answer was correct, but Marin had finished well before him. More participants were eliminated. The field was down to 4. Marin, Pierce, and 2 other doctoral candidates who were beginning to look very nervous. The semifinal pairings were announced, supposedly random. Marin versus Pierce and the 2 doctoral candidates against each other. If you believe that pairing was random, you have not been paying attention to this story. That evening, the story started to spread. The post from the first round had gone viral in academic circles. A mathematics blog published a short article with the headline, "Who is Marin Caldwell?" Someone dug up her Howard University transcript and posted it online. A journalist from the Boston Globe sent an email to Harvard's press office asking for comment. The story was no longer just about a competition. It was about a system, and people were watching. Back at her motel, far from campus, Marin sat on the edge of the bed under a single lamp. A gas station sandwich sat half-eaten on the nightstand. Her notebook was open in her lap. She was reviewing graph theory problems, writing out solutions in handwriting so small it barely fit on the page. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, but from exhaustion, from the weight of spending day after day in a room that punished her for existing, from smiling through insults, from pretending she did not hear the whispers, from solving problems at the highest level while carrying the invisible weight that no one else in that competition had to carry. There was a knock at the door. Zora. She came in and sat on the only chair in the room. She looked at Marin's hands. She looked at the sandwich. She looked at the notebook. She did not say anything for a long while. Then she said, "You do not have to prove anything to them." Marin did not look up. "I am not proving anything to them. Then who?" Marin stopped writing. She stared at the wall for a moment. Then she said, "Every girl in Anacostia who thinks this door is locked." Zora did not respond. There was nothing to say to that. It was the truest sentence either of them had spoken. When Marin walked back into the lecture hall, the room was already buzzing. More people had shown up than before. Word had spread. A few faces in the crowd were new. One of them belonged to a journalist with a notebook. Pierce Langford was sitting in the front row reviewing notes. He looked relaxed, confident. He had every reason to be. He had spent years studying under Whitlock. He had access to research papers, seminar materials, and techniques that were not available to anyone outside Harvard's inner circle. Marin had a backpack and a cracked tablet, but she also had something Pierce did not have. She had spent countless hours alone with numbers, not in a classroom, not with a tutor, not with a professor guiding her through the difficult parts. Alone in a room with a single lamp. And in all those hours, she had learned something no seminar could teach. She had learned to see the shape of problems she had never seen before. She sat down. She opened her notebook. She waited. She had solved problem after problem, but the next one was different. This one was built to break her. The semifinal problem appeared on the board. Marin looked at it. Pierce looked at it. The room looked at it. Pierce smiled. Marin did not. The problem involved proving a tight bound on a specific connectivity property in random networks. It was advanced. It was elegant. And it was not from any textbook, any published paper, or any publicly available source. It was from Professor Whitlock's own unpublished research. The technique required to solve it had only ever been taught in one place: Whitlock's private advanced seminar, a seminar reserved for his hand-picked doctoral students. Pierce Langford had taken that seminar. He had studied that technique. He had practiced it. He recognized the problem the way you recognize a song you have heard 100 times. Marin Caldwell had never seen it. She had never been invited to the seminar. She had never had access to the research. She was looking at a problem specifically chosen to guarantee she would lose. The field had been tilted, not through an obvious rule change, not through anything anyone could point to and call cheating, through problem selection, the most elegant kind of rigging, the kind that looks fair on paper and is rotten underneath. And there was something else, something Marin would not learn until after it was over. Her score in the second round had been changed. Her actual score, the one written on the panel's original scoring sheet, was 98. The score announced to the room was 91, 7 points stolen. If the real score had stood, Marin would have entered the semifinal with a commanding lead. Instead, she entered believing she was barely ahead. 2 manipulations, 2 invisible walls, both built by the same man. At the panel table, Dr. Calloway read the problem and her expression changed. She recognized it immediately. She had reviewed Whitlock's unpublished draft earlier as part of a peer consultation. She knew exactly where this problem came from, and she knew exactly what it meant. She wrote a note on her pad and slid it to the panelists beside her. It read, "This is from his draft. I need the original scoring sheets from the second round." The panelist read the note. He looked at Calloway. She did not look back. She was watching the board. The clock started. Pierce picked up his chalk with the confidence of a man who already knew the answer. Marin picked up hers with the focus of a woman who knew she was walking into a trap, but she picked it up anyway. Pierce moved like a man taking a test he had already seen the answers to. His chalk flowed across the board in smooth, confident strokes. Every line followed the next without hesitation. He was not solving the problem. He was performing the solution. The technique from Whitlock's seminar fit the problem like a key in a lock. The room watched him with quiet admiration. Early on, he was already far ahead. Marin was working from first principles. No shortcut, no memorized technique. She was building the solution from the ground up, brick by brick, using only the tools she had brought with her, the ones she had taught herself in a motel room, a community center, and a bedroom in Anacostia with one lamp and a cracked tablet. It was not fast enough. Pierce was almost finished. Marin was only partway through. The gap was visible. The audience could see it. The whispering started. She is falling behind. She had a good run. This was always going to happen. Blaine Mercer leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. He looked satisfied. Whitlock sat in the audience with his hands folded. His expression was calm, patient, the expression of a man watching a trap work exactly as designed. Then Marin made a mistake. She transposed two indices in her derivation. A small error, the kind that happens when your brain is running faster than your hand. She caught it almost immediately, but the correction cost her time she did not have. Pierce was nearly done. Marin was staring at a board full of work that was not finished. And then something happened that had not happened at any point in this story. Marin stopped writing. Her chalk hand dropped. Her shoulders shifted. Her breathing changed. For a moment, she looked like a woman who was about to put the chalk down and walk away from the board. The whole room saw it. Some felt sympathy. Some felt vindicated. Blaine Mercer almost laughed. Zora Dawson, sitting several rows back, was gripping the armrest so hard her knuckles were pale. She was not breathing. Then Marin looked up. Not at the board. Not at Pierce. Not at Whitlock. She looked at the audience, and somewhere in the room, her eyes found Zora. Zora did not nod. She did not smile. She did not mouth any words of encouragement. She just looked at Marin, steady, unblinking, without pity, without fear. Sometimes the most powerful thing someone can do is simply refuse to look away. Marin turned back to the board. She stared at her work. Then she did something no one expected. She erased 3 lines. Not a correction. Not a fix. She wiped out an entire section of her approach and started over. She abandoned the standard path completely. She was not going to chase Pierce's technique. She was not going to play the game Whitlock had designed for her to lose. She was going to build her own. A new construction appeared on the board. An auxiliary graph. A mapping between 2 structures that no one in the room had seen before. She was not following any textbook. She was not applying any known method. She was inventing something in real time, under pressure, with the room watching and the clock counting down. Pierce put his chalk down. Done. The room applauded. His solution was clean, correct, and built on the technique he had been handed. Whitlock nodded in approval. Marin was still writing. Her chalk moved fast, faster than it had moved all day. New lines, new inequalities. The auxiliary graph was taking shape. The time was nearly gone. She was running out of board space. She moved to the bottom right corner and wrote the final line, small but clear, the line that completed the proof. The buzzer sounded. But Dr. Lenora Calloway had been watching the entire board from the panel table, and she had seen something everyone else missed. Marin stepped back from the board. The buzzer was still ringing in the air. Whitlock stood. He walked to the front of the room with the slow, measured stride of a man who had already decided the outcome. He positioned himself directly in front of the whiteboard, directly in front of the bottom right corner, where Marin had written her final line, and faced the audience. "Time," he said. "Mr. Langford has completed his solution. Unfortunately, Miss Caldwell's work appears to be incomplete." He gestured toward the board behind him. From the audience's angle, the main body of Marin's proof was visible. The auxiliary graph, the mapping, the inequalities. But the final line, the one she had written in the corner in the last moments, was hidden behind Whitlock's body. The room saw an unfinished board. Pierce was awarded the round. The audience clapped, polite and restrained, the kind of applause that says, "Well, that is that." Marin stood at the side of the stage, silent and still. Her face gave away nothing. Zora had tears running down her face. Not because it was sad, because it was unfair. Because everyone in the room had just watched a rigged game produce exactly the result it was rigged to produce. Pierce shook hands with two of the panelists. Whitlock was already preparing to announce the final round format. The story, it seemed, was over. Every person in that room thought it was over. Then Dr. Lenora Calloway spoke. Professor Whitlock. Her voice was not loud. She did not raise it. She did not need to. It was the kind of voice that stops a room, not because of its volume, but because of its authority. Years at Princeton, hundreds of published papers, a named chair in number theory. When Lenora Calloway said your name, you stopped what you were doing. Whitlock stopped. Before you proceed, Calloway said, I would like to examine Miss Caldwell's board. Whitlock blinked. The solution is incomplete, Dr. Calloway. We all saw. Humor me. 2 words. The room went silent. Not the uncomfortable silence from before, a different kind. The kind where a whole room suddenly realizes it might be about to witness something it did not expect. Calloway stood. She pushed her chair back. She walked from the panel table to the whiteboard. Every eye in the room followed her. Whitlock had no choice. A Princeton professor and a fellow of the American Mathematical Society had made a public request to examine a contestant's work. Refusing would be an admission that he had something to hide. He stepped aside, and when he moved, the bottom right corner of the board became visible. Calloway began at the first line. She traced Marin's proof with her finger. The auxiliary graph construction, the bijection, the one-to-one mapping between edge sets in the original problem and vertex covers in the new structure, the probabilistic counting argument, each step building on the last, clean, logical, original. Her finger reached the end of the main body of work. She kept going. It moved to the bottom right corner. She stopped. She read the final line. She read it again. Then she turned to face the room. A heavy silence filled the hall. In that silence, hundreds of people were confused. Pierce was frowning. Whitlock's smile was frozen in place like a mask that no longer fit. Zora had stopped breathing. Marin had not moved. Then Calloway spoke. The proof is complete. She pointed to the corner. The final line is here, written before the clock expired. She paused. She looked at the board one more time. Then she said, The bound is tight. The bijection is original. And it is, without question, the most elegant proof presented in this competition. For one more breath, the room was still. One more breath of people processing what they had just heard. One more breath of recalculating everything they thought they knew. Then the room broke open. It did not start with applause. It started with a gasp from somewhere near the front, then a murmur that rippled outward like a stone dropped into water, then clapping. Not the polite kind from before, the real kind. The kind that starts in one place and spreads until it fills the room. Students stood. The postdoctoral researcher in the front row covered her mouth with both hands. 2 professors on the panel started clapping before the third had even processed what had happened. Zora was sobbing, not quietly. The kind of crying that comes from somewhere deep, from a place where every insult, every dismissal, every closed door had been stored and compressed, and was now releasing all at once. Pierce Langford stared at the bottom right corner of the board. He stared at it for a long time. Then he turned to Marin. He did not look angry. He did not look resentful. He looked like a man who had just watched someone do something he could not do. He started clapping. He was the first person standing in his row. Whitlock did not clap. He did not stand. He stood at the side of the stage and looked at the corner of the board, the corner he had been standing in front of, the corner he had blocked when he declared her solution incomplete. Whether he knew the final line was there as a question only he can answer, but the room saw where he had been standing, and the room would remember. Marin did not celebrate. She did not pump her fist. She did not cry. She closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, she looked at the board. Not at the audience, not at Whitlock, not at the cameras. She looked at her own work, because the proof was the only thing in that room that had never lied to her. Calloway turned to the panel. I move that we reevaluate the semifinal scores. Miss Caldwell's proof is not only complete, it is superior. The bijection is original. The approach is more general than the standard method. I further move that the competition be awarded outright. There is nothing a final round could add. The panel voted unanimously. Marin Caldwell won the Whitlock challenge. Pierce shook her hand. That bijection was something I have never seen. Where did it come from? Marin looked at him. I did not have your technique, so I had to build my own path. Pierce paused, then said quietly, Your path was better. The room was still applauding, but the story was not over, because Dr. Calloway was not finished. She had one more thing to say, and when she said it, the applause would stop, and the silence that followed would be the loudest sound that room had ever heard. The applause was still fading when Calloway stood again. Nobody had left. The hall was full, phones still out, some still recording. She walked to the center of the stage carrying 2 documents. Before we conclude, there is a matter of record. The room went quiet. She held up the first document. The semifinal problem was traced to an unpublished research draft authored by Professor Whitlock. The technique required to solve it was taught exclusively in his private seminar, available only to his doctoral students. She held up the second document. This is the original scoring sheet from the second round. Miss Caldwell's actual score was 98. The score announced to this room was 91. She placed both documents on the table. The discrepancy has been documented. Every head turned to Whitlock. Then the phones came up. Not a few. A sea of them. Red recording lights blinked across the auditorium like unblinking eyes. Dean Sellis Prescott stood from the audience. He saw the phones. He saw the journalist from the Boston Globe scribbling notes. The Whitlock lecture series is suspended immediately pending review by the Office of Academic Integrity. Professor Whitlock, you are relieved of all administrative duties, including department chair, effective now. He paused. Additionally, I believe an acknowledgement is owed to Miss Caldwell. Professor Whitlock. Every camera pointed at one man. Whitlock stood. His face was gray. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Miss Caldwell, I owe you an apology. The competition should have been conducted fairly. It was not. That is my responsibility. The words came out like they were being pulled with pliers, but they were public. They were recorded. They could never be unsaid. In the hours that followed, the video reached millions of views. By the next news cycle, the story was on the front page of the Boston Globe, the New York Times, and cable news network. Former students came forward with similar accounts. His publisher paused his textbook. Speaking invitations vanished. A lifetime of prestige collapsed almost overnight. Harvard does not fire tenured professors. It lets them become invisible. Later, the lecture hall was empty. Marin came back to collect a notebook she had left behind. The room was silent. The seats were empty. The lights were dim. But the whiteboard was still there, and her proof was still on it. No one had erased it. She was not alone. Whitlock was standing in front of the board, not performing, not lecturing, just standing there, looking at her work. His career was in ruins. His name had been removed from the series his family built. His office had been reassigned, but none of that was on his face right then. He was just looking at the math. He heard her footsteps and turned. Miss Caldwell, the bijection. Where did you learn that technique? I did not learn it. I built it. A long pause, the longest silence between two people in this entire story. No cameras, no audience, no performance. Just a man and a woman and a proof on a board. Yes, he said, I can see that. It was not an apology. The apology had already been extracted in public in front of cameras, and it had meant nothing. This was different. This was a man standing alone in front of a proof he could not have written. admitting to himself as much as to her that he had been wrong about her. Marin received the letter of recommendation reviewed by committee. She applied to 3 doctoral programs and was accepted to all 3. She chose the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, not Harvard. She did not choose the institution that finally let her in. She chose the one that wanted her from the start. On the bus ride home to Washington, District of Columbia, she called Zora. "How does it feel?" Marin thought for a moment. "It feels like the door was never locked. We just could not see the handle." Honestly, this one hits different, because Marin did not argue. She did not beg. She showed up and let the work speak, and the man who tried to erase her. Everybody saw him instead. That is the truth. You can try to block it, but you are not stopping it. If this story reminded you of someone whose talent the world has not seen yet, send it to them. And if you want more stories like this, subscribe, because Marin Caldwell is not the last. She is just the beginning.